Good morning, everyone.
Good morning,
Good
Rabbi.
morning.
We're learning Mishnah and Megillah. We're starting Parak Beis, chapter 2. Today we're going to do Mishnah Aleph and Beis, 1 and 2. HaKares HaMegillah Mafreya. If somebody reads a Megillah backwards, out of order, he reads chapter 2 before chapter 1. Lo Yatza. He has not fulfilled his obligation. Kara al Peh. Say he read it by heart, without reading it from a complete kosher Megillah scroll. Kara Targum. He read it in the Targum, in the Aramaic translation, meaning he read it as that. Instead of reading it in the Lashon Kodesh, in the Hebrew language, he read it in the Targum, in the Aramaic translation language, or an Aramaic translation. B'chol lashon, or in any language, lo yatsa, he has not fulfilled his obligation. Now, what that means right now is, as you'll see very soon, when it says that if he read it in any other language in Hebrew, he has not fulfilled his obligation, means if he doesn't understand that language. Because look at the next part of the Mishnah. But you can read it for foreigners in their foreign language. So Megillah, and by the way, if you're going to read it for the foreigners in their foreign language, then it has to be written in a foreign language. Because otherwise, if you're reading from a Hebrew scroll and just then saying it in French, you're doing it by heart. So the Megillah itself would have to be read, had to be written in that foreign language. So in the Mishnah said before that if you read it as the Targum in any language, you're not fulfilling the obligation. That means if you don't understand it. And the notes they bring down for the Meiri, the explanation to that is we read the Megillah in order to publicize the miracle of Purim, Persumei Nisa. If this is achieved only if a person understands what he's reading. That's that makes a lot. That's a very good explanation. The Meiri is explaining that if you don't understand what's being said, how is there a publicizing of the miracle from your part? So therefore, it has to be that you understand it. However, the Mishnah still concludes that a foreigner who hears it in Ashuris, and again, Ashuris means the Hebrew language written in Ashuris. Yeah. Instead of saying that's how the Mishnah refers to the Hebrew language, but a foreigner, meaning someone who doesn't understand Hebrew, but he hears it in Ashuris. It means he hears it in its regular form, that is written from a scroll in Ashuris in the Hebrew language. Yatsa, he has fulfilled his obligation. So this is a very big difference. If you don't understand the Hebrew language, then if you hear the Megillah in Hebrew, you have fulfilled your obligation. If you hear the Megillah in the foreign language you understand and it's written in that language, fulfilled your obligation. If you hear it in a language you don't understand other than Hebrew, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Now, what's the explanation if we said before, if you don't understand the language, you can't fulfill your mitzvah because there's no publicizing of the miracle if you don't understand what's being said. So if you don't understand Hebrew, then how does it work? So the way they bring down here again from the Meiri is, since most Jews understand Hebrew, you can ask someone what the words mean. So he'll hear it in Hebrew, which means he may not understand it. My understanding is he may not hear it as the words are being read. He may not understand it, but at the end of the day, he could ask somebody what it meant. And therefore, since he could ask somebody what it meant, there's most people around that can understand what it's meant, what it means. Therefore, he can still fulfill his obligation. So the explanation here is interesting, but the bottom line of the halacha, the Mishnah is that if you hear the Megillah in Hebrew, in the Lashon Kodesh, and it's written that Lashon Kodesh, then you can fulfill your mitzvah if you don't understand it. While if you're going to hear it in a different language, you have to understand it, and it has to be written in that language. Mishnah Beis. Kara Seirugin. He read it in parts. That means he read a little bit, took a break, nice long break, and then he continued again. So basically, he's taken a lot of breaks in the reading of the Megillah, and those breaks can be quite long. Misnamname, or he read it as he was half asleep. We'll explain what half asleep means in a second. Yatsa, he has fulfilled his obligation. So even with all those interruptions, all those breaks, and that's what the Bartanura explains it. Shakara ma'at v'shah. He read a little bit and he waited, and the Bartanura says those delays can take a very long time. That delay can be as long as it would take you to finish the whole Megillah. Nonetheless, if that is how you go ahead and you read the Megillah, you still fulfilled your obligation. Now then the Mishnah says misnamneim, the person is half asleep. So half asleep is explained in the notes in the following way. Misnamneim is the state in which one is neither fully awake nor fully asleep. If someone calls him, he will answer. but he cannot give an answer that requires thought. If he is reminded of something that he knows, he will recall it. Okay. See if where the largest shark was caught, right? You know it. So then, and that would be something that doesn't take much thought for some people, and therefore that's what you can do. Even if he's half asleep, if you know that fact, we assume you can recall it just by your knowledge. Being half asleep is not going to be a problem there, because although you are half asleep, as long as you can respond to such a question that you know, and it doesn't take any kind of thought. It's not like you're asking a person to figure out something for you. He's too asleep for that. But he's awake enough that he can respond to something that he can recall. Then, even in such a state, a person's intent can be clear enough to enable him to fulfill his obligation. Okay, so that's the first part of the Mishnah. Then the Mishnah continues. Hayakaisva. He was in the middle of reading a Megillah. He was in the middle of writing a Megillah. Okay. And we have to add for this case, he was writing it. And as he was writing it, he was saying the words. You can't fulfill your mitzvah by writing a Megillah. It has to be that you are reading the words. As you're writing, you're saying, let's say you're saying the words of the Megillah, and then you write them. And as the Bartanura adds, it has to be talking about, you can't be doing it by heart, right? You can't read a Megillah by heart. Mm-hmm. So that means that you have a complete kosher scroll in front of you, and you read it from there, and then you write, and you read from there, and you write. Okay, that's what you're doing. And again, he's trying to write a Megillah now, but it's Purim, and this is how he's doing it. Darsha, or let's say, as he is reading the Megillah, he's darshaning, he's explaining it, he's teaching it. Umagia, let's say he has a Megillah and he's correcting it. So in all these cases, he has another purpose in why he is reading the Megillah. Mm-hmm. Says the Mishnah, Im kiven liba yatsa. If he has the intent to fulfill his mitzvah, then he has fulfilled his mitzvah. Vimla, but if he doesn't have intent to fulfill his mitzvah, lo yatsa, he hasn't fulfilled it. Not enough that you just did it. You just did the reading of the Megillah for you to count for your mitzvah. You have to have when you're reading the Megillah, you have to have the intent that you want to do it for the mitzvah. And therefore, the Mishnah says, "And keep in libai." If he had the intent to fulfill his mitzvah while doing this, if he can fulfill his obligation. But if not, then he has to fulfill his obligation. So, if this person again, he has a Megillah, kosher Megillah scroll in front of him, and he reads it and he writes. So again, what's your intent? Is it just for the purposes of writing a Megillah, nothing to do with your mitzvah? Then you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah. But if your intent while you're doing it is to fulfill your mitzvah also, you fulfilled it. Or let's say you're correcting the Megillah, the same idea. As long as you are reading from a kosher Megillah and you're reading it and then you're doing your correcting, the halacha is you're going to fulfill your mitzvah if that's your intent. Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. Then the second part of the Mishnah goes like this. Haisa kasuba. If let's say you had a Megillah and it was written bisam. Sam they translate here as orpiment, which in parentheses they say is a yellow dye. And then the next one is, that's sam. Next one is sikra. Sikra they translate as vermilion, which is a red dye. That was sikra. Uva kaimais. Kaimais they translate as gum Arabic, which is a tree sap. Uva kankantum, or ferrous sulfite. In parentheses they say an iron salt. Mm-hmm. So these are all things you can write with. Alanayar valadiftera. Now we're talking about what's written on, or if it's on paper. Paper is where you take, the Bartanura explains, paper means you take different plants or grasses and you glue them together. That's how you make your writing surface. Or it's diphthera. Diphthera is unfinished parchment. I don't know what all the steps of tanning is, but the point is you didn't finish it. La yatsa. In these cases, you have not fulfilled your obligation of reading the Megillah. Why? Because you have to read from a kosher Megillah scroll. And if you write it in any of these manners, it is not kosher as a scroll. Until, meaning once you have a Megillah that is written, ad means unless it is written ashuris, Hebrew, ala sefer. Sefer means parchment, a scroll of parchment. Ubediyai. Diyai is black ink. Mm-hmm. That is black ink, they say here in the notes from the Tiferes Yisrael, blank ink that keeps its color when written on parchment. That is the kind of ink that you may use to fulfill that can only use a fulfill your mitzvah. You cannot use paper or papyrus. You have to use cloth, which is a scroll from animal hide, parchment, as we say. Okay. Now, Mishna also said it's got to be written ashuris. Now that contradicts what we just said before, right?
Yeah.
Before we said it doesn't have to be written ashuris. So the explanation that's given is you're right. Taisvus Yantiv says, brought here down the notes. The Mishnah doesn't mean it has to be written ashuris. But the Mishnah means to say when it comes to the other part about cloth that has to be on parchment, ubedyai, and with the black ink, that's mandatory.
Mm-hmm.
But when the Mishnah said ashuris, it meant to say it's talking about a scroll that everybody can use, right? If it's written in Hebrew, whether you understand it or not, you can use it. So in the Mishnah here, we're saying what Mishnah is basically saying here for a scroll that could be used by everyone, that is one that is written ashuris, Hebrew language. Anybody can fulfill the mitzvah from that. It's got to be on sefer, on parchment, and it has to be written with diyai, with black ink. That again, they say black ink that keeps its color when written on parchment. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbos.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
There's different types of